Reaching back into my archives today, I want to play an interview. One of those interviews that you might say at first, this doesn't have anything to do with trend following. But then you listen and you say to yourself, this has everything to do with trend following. I hope you enjoy. Before I jump into my guest today, I have a request, a simple little request. If you like this podcast, go to iTunes and write a review. I would most appreciate that. It kind of keeps the whole thing going, the process keeps me going. Now, I just noticed, actually, the most recent review on iTunes. It's pure gold. I'm already laughing. It's pure gold. So I'm at 600 plus episodes, 6 Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, you name it, I've talked to. It's a lot of work since 2012. The most recent review, this is just absolutely gold. I want to get a tattoo. I have no tattoos, but I want to get a tattoo of this review. The subject heading, so bad, ranting nonsense. The review. This is brutal. This guy has issues and uses this podcast as a therapy session. Pure garbage. Oh my God. That is just absolutely awesome. Don't you know that I probably know that person, right? It's somebody in my world and they're offended by something I did, and that's their way they get back at me. Which, of course, leads me to the discussion of the mind. I mean, it doesn't really lead me to the discussion of the mind, but the most important thing today is my guest. I mean, it's funny that someone wrote a review like that, because here is the counter to that review. My guest today, Alison Gopnik. She's an American professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. She's known for her work in the areas of cognitive and language development, specializing in the effect of language on thought, the development of a theory of mind, and casual learning. Definitely check her TED Talk out. Really interesting stuff. She starts her analysis, gets down to child development and looking at how we learn and we grow from the earliest months in our lives. And for those of you that might be thinking this is not your thing, trust me, Alison might have the most energy of any guest I've ever had on this show. And for someone that can make up the term Bayesian babies, which would be Thomas Bayes, Bayesian statistics, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Let's jump right in with my conversation with Alison Gopnik. Professor, I have to say, when I dig into your world, my first thought that I have, I want to be in your class. I'm 49 years of age. I want to be in your class. I was thinking, why do I want to be in her class? And you can just feel this insatiable curiosity. I want to know for you. This goes right to the heart of your work. Try and place for me how that insatiable curiosity began for you. Look, we're going to talk about child development today. You must have had great parents.
Yeah, well, I had a very interesting childhood and very rich and wonderful childhood. But a big feature of it was that I'm actually the oldest of 6 children. I was involved and engaged with children for as long as I can remember. And I had this wonderful bohemian 1950s, early 60s childhood where my parents were actually graduate students and then young faculty, but they were basically crazy bohemians. And we had an amazingly wonderful, rich, again, slightly crazy life. I was a child actor, for example, for 5 years when I was a kid. And we went to see the opening of the Guggenheim when I was 4 and my brother was 3. We drove from Philadelphia to New York to see the opening of the Guggenheim. That was just the sort of thing that my parents thought made a lot of sense to do. So I personally had a wonderful, vivid childhood. But I think also being the oldest sister of 6, meant that I was very conscious of what the younger children were like and how interesting they were, and in some sense how much people outside didn't appreciate how interesting and smart and just fascinating they were.
Do you have a moment in time being the oldest of six as a keen, obviously a keen observer, and that I'm sure you would say that translates in many ways to your current adult life, but as a keen observer from very young people at a very young age, is there a moment, was there something in observing your siblings that you can think back to that's like, wow, that's just fascinating to me. I'm in awe of that, or something that struck you early on?
Well, actually, it's funny because the moment that I can remember most vividly was that I was actually reading philosophy. So I'm an affiliate professor in philosophy, and my first degree was actually in philosophy. And when I was about 10 or 11, I read Plato's Apology with I read Plato's Phaedo, which is one of the dialogues where he talks about the fact that people would have to exist in another world, another Platonic universe before and after this life, because after all, it doesn't make any sense to think that we just have this limited existence in the world and nothing comes before and nothing comes after. And what struck me in that conversation was that it just seemed obvious to me that a way that you continued on in the world was through your children, that you had children, that you raised children, that each generation of children was going on in the world. And it was amazing to me that for these incredibly smart philosophers who I tremendously admired, like Socrates, the possibility of even thinking about children didn't even show up in that dialogue. And I can remember being very struck by the fact, like, what was wrong with these guys? Why weren't they going to the obvious answer, which was thinking about the way that children make you immortal and extend you into the future and the past? And that reaction was a reaction that has really shaped the whole rest of my career. It's been, look, here's this deep, important, interesting question. It's just obvious that children are going to be able to tell you something about it. And yet the attitude towards children for all those years, even when people were sort of abstractly interested, was that they were part of the world of women and domestic life and were part of the sort of serious intellectual philosophical universe.
I love one of the ways that you phrase this, and I had so many aha moments going through your world. Babies are like the research and development operation or arm of the human species. I mean, this is where it starts.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you actually spend time sitting and watching babies, another vivid moment that I remember was when I was in my first year of graduate school, which is a wonderful time for anyone. Andrew Maltzoff, who became a famous developmental psychologist and was a young fellow graduate student, I guess I was just turned 20. We were sitting in a field looking at a bunch of babies who were just crawling around on picnic blankets in a field the way that babies do. And we just counted up how many experiments does a baby do in the course of the 5 minutes that we were watching them. And I highly recommend this. It's a really fascinating exercise. Just take, anybody under the age of 3 and just watch them for 10 minutes and count how many things they find out about, how many things they think about, how many things they try, just in that tiny brief period of time, and then compare that to how many new ideas or new discoveries you have in the course of maybe 5 years. And the babies, it's pretty clear that the babies are finding out more about the world in 5 minutes than most of us do in 5 years. And I think that's actually a really important biological fact about who we are as humans.
I like to tell people all the time that I'm a big baby, and not like in some weak way, but really because I try every day. And I think I'm very lucky with this podcast to talk to people like yourself. It keeps me fresh. It keeps things open. It doesn't close doors. Every time I get on this show, I'm like, wow, that was amazing. I can't believe they dedicated their life to that. And then I get to pick their mind and see something really interesting that I never even considered.
Well, one of the ideas that I've been working on most recently, is the idea that there's this kind of basic tension. You see it in neuroscience, you see it in computer science, you see it in technology. There's this basic tension between what people call exploration and exploitation. You're trying to solve a problem. One thing to do is to look around and try and explore as many different possible solutions as you possibly can. Another thing is to narrow in on one or two solutions and really implement them, really make them happen. And I think it's important that you need to do both. So we would not want to have a world where everyone was like a 4-year-old, for one thing, because a bunch of other people would have to be taking care of that 4-year-old. There's something to be said for these adult skills of focus and narrow attention and executive function and planning and all the things that we're very good at doing in adults, the things that the production and marketing divisions, as it were, are doing. But all of that wouldn't have nearly as much potency if we didn't also have both individual people or times in our lives or developmental periods when instead we could just be exploring. We could just be finding out new things for the hell of it. We could just be curious. Here at Berkeley, there's just a lovely new study that some of my colleagues in AI have done where they took one of these very powerful machine learning algorithms and they just gave it curiosity. They added a bit that said, okay, when you're trying to solve these problems, just go out and try and get more information for the sake of more information. And it looks as if that would be counterproductive, right? You're supposed to be solving a problem. You're not supposed to be just going around and trying to find out more about the world. But it turns out that that kind of system is actually more effective than a system that's just narrowly focused on accomplishing particular goals. And I think that's the function that preschoolers play for us. And if you sit down next to a preschooler and just watch them for a while, one of the great pleasures of developmental psychology is you can actually see that happen. You can see it unfold before your eyes.
I've got a ton of questions here. I want to dive at the child level, but I think it'd be very useful for the audience for you to give the big picture and the term I want to use from your world and many of your peers' world, life history. And why don't you explain life history from your perspective and perhaps contrast that life history to other animals, like other primates? We're kind of very different, us humans, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting. If you go and you talk to evolutionary biologists, one of the ideas that they come back to again and again is the idea of life history. Life history is the way that an organism develops over its entire lifespan. So not just what's the organism like at its peak, as it were, but how long a period of childhood does it have? How long does it live? When does it reproduce? When does it become senescent? When does it die? That profile, that trajectory, turns out to be a really, really important factor in lots of arguments in evolutionary biology. And if you can imagine biologists from Alpha Centauri coming to Earth 150,000 years ago and looking at these new creatures that had just evolved, these little funny primates scurrying around on the veldt and trying to figure out what's special about these creatures, what makes them distinctive, the thing that would leap out at her is, my goodness, these creatures have a really bizarre life history, because what she would have noticed is that human beings have twice as long a childhood, twice as long a period of immaturity as any of our closest relatives. So chimpanzees are producing as much food as they're consuming by the time they're 7. Even in hunter-gatherer cultures, we aren't doing that till we're 15. And, my son is 30 and we're still writing tuition checks and writing tuition and rent checks when they're 30. Now, that seems paradoxical. Why would you set up a species so that there's this long period when they're not producing anything, and worse than that, they're actually requiring all these resources from us just to keep them alive? So it's a very distinctive, striking thing about us. And if you compare us to, say, chimpanzees, to our closest primate relatives, we seem to have a lot of other adaptations designed just to deal with that long period of immaturity. So we have pair bonding. We have males and females who are close and who take care of children together. Only 5% of all mammals have pair bonding. We have what anthropologists call alloparenting, which means that we have non-biological kin who are helping to take care of babies. And we have my own personal favorite, namely grandmothers. So another really strange thing about our life history, again, very distinctive, is that we have females who are living past menopause. And we in general live to our 70s as opposed to chimps who live to their 50s. So not only do we have this long extra period early in life, we have this long extra period later in life. So all that seems very puzzling. And it's striking because when you look at lots and lots and lots of other animals, not just primates, not even just mammals, but say birds and even insects, you see this relationship between how long a childhood a species has and how smart and flexible and good at learning they are as adults. So there seems to be some connection between this life history, this long childhood, and then these very distinctive capacities that we have as adults for flexibility and learning.
That starts to get right at the heart of the matter, where I was so fascinated with your work. And you're getting at, okay, if we have this long period where young people are developing and they really can't take care of themselves, and perhaps the rest of adult society is constantly thinking, well, they're not, they're just there, they're not doing much En contraire, they are doing quite a lot. And I would love for you to explain the expression. I find it fascinating. It dovetails right into my world, at least the Bayesian part. But Bayesian babies, these babies are doing quite a bit. And it is, you just read this for the first time, you're like, wow.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, one of the things that psychologists have said for a while, my colleague Danny Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for saying this, is people are really bad at doing probability and statistics. And it's true that adults are very bad at doing probability and statistics if you actually give them a statistical problem. But it turns out that even 8-month-olds are actually extremely good at doing probability and statistics, and they can do pretty sophisticated kinds of Bayesian inference, but they do it unconsciously. They do it without knowing that that's what they're doing. And what we've been doing in my lab over the last 15 years or so is just giving children problems to solve that from the child's perspective are just a problem like, look, here's this machine and I'm putting blocks on it and tell me how the machine works. Sometimes the machine lights up, sometimes it doesn't. What's happening? How can you make the machine work? That's a very simple, practical thing that babies and children are very excited about doing. But it turns out that with that very simple kind of setup, you can show that the children are actually doing really sophisticated kinds of analyses of the data and ways of combining the data. Some interesting experiments that we've recently done. The preschoolers are actually in some ways better at doing that than adults, in the sense that the preschoolers actually take the data more into consideration. The adults seem to be designed to rely more heavily on what they already know. It really takes a lot of new data to change an adult's mind. Whereas for the children who know less to begin with, they know less to begin with, and they also seem to be designed to really pay attention to the data that's around them. That's the thing that's most important for them. The children seem to be able to do things like use conditional probabilities to infer causal structure from the time they're 2 or 3 years old, which is, I agree, it's really, really amazing. And only one of the amazing things that have come out of work in developmental psychology over the last 30 years or so.
When you say that, the ability, the conditional probability ability as a very, very young child. Now, some people might be thinking, and I made the compliment to you at the top, I said, you must have had a great parenting system, great family life. And you said you gave a great story. Some people might be thinking, well, gosh, that's only if it's not for all kids. Speak to the issue, though, of that, the economic issue, children that come from the wrong side of the tracks. They don't have all the advantages. Speak to that. It becomes it's the nature nurture issue.
One of the things that we know, and again, this kind of goes with the whole life history perspective, is that you can only have that period of exploration if you also have a protected, nurturing environment. And there's at least some evidence with non-human animals that animals who are stressed early in life, for example, seem to mature more quickly. So they were sort of forced into that adult state more quickly than animals who are nurtured. But I think it's important to say that nurturance, it means having people around you who love you and care for you. It doesn't mean having people who are putting you in, mini Harvard preschool, or it doesn't mean people who are going out and giving you flashcards. In fact, there's some interesting recent studies that suggest that when children are in a pedagogical situation where they feel as if they're being taught, that actually narrows the range of options they can consider. It actually makes them explore less. And we actually recently published a study just this year, 2017. We were curious about this. So we actually went to look at children in Head Start programs in Oakland. And we also looked at children who were growing up in low-income parts of Lima, Peru, sort of in the favelas in the suburbs of Lima. And we thought, well, maybe these children are going to have more trouble with the causal inference tasks than the children in the middle-class preschools. What we discovered was, if anything, it was just the opposite. Especially these children in Peru were doing incredibly well on these causal tests. And the children in Head Start, even though they do worse if you do a formal IQ test, for example, they do worse on executive function tests. We were sort of surprised by how good they were, as good or better than the middle-class kids at solving these kind of spontaneous learning tests. Now, remember, from the kids' perspective, this isn't learning, it's not school, it's just here's a cool toy to play with and you're trying to figure out how it works. But I think it's important to say that the kids that we were looking at, both in Peru and in Head Start, are kids who are low income, but who have parents who care enough about them to make sure that they get into Head Start programs or into these schools in Peru. So I think it's important to say that the kids need this kind of nurturant, supportive, extended family environment, which is what they have in Peru. I think that kids are not going to do well on these things in situations of stress, violence, isolation, the situations in which very many children in America, by the way, are growing up. But it isn't as if what children need is to have the middle-class parent who's hovering over them and making sure that they, do their worksheets.
I have a side question for you about your personality, your perspective, your purpose as I listen to you. Why are you so passionate?
One thing about the kind of work that I do is that I'm with kids a lot of the time. Not actually quite as much time as I'd like, but a lot of the time. And, there are some kinds of projects, some kinds of professions where you do something because you think it's important abstractly, but you don't have an immediate sense of it being important every day. And one of the nice things about working with kids is you get to see the kids, and it hits you over the head every time you see a 3-year-old, just how smart and interesting and open to the world they actually are. And I think, one of the questions that people often ask is, well, as an adult, how can you keep this very open sense of exploration and possibility that children have? And I think actually having children, hanging out with children is a really important part of that. And I think even though we kind of give lip service to, yes, the children are our future and children are important, it's still true that, I've given talks at, for example, and it is true that if you're in a room full of people and you say that you study children, you can kind of see the glazing. Yeah. At least you used to see the eyes glazing over. That's not quite so true anymore, because I think people are starting to realize just how important this early period is. But it's a bit ironic that the way they realized it was because economists started telling them that there were going to be really good returns on investment. Whereas I think for me, it was sitting in the room with 3-year-olds, it was pretty obvious.
When you open up Pandora's box and you start talking about Bayesian babies and conditional probabilities, that room full of suits and that doesn't think they want to listen might all of a sudden go, what did she just say? Hold on, I better pay attention.
Well, one of the really exciting things that's happening just at this moment is that if you look at the AI community, one of the things that people have really realized, part of the new excitement about artificial intelligence, comes because people are starting to make systems that can learn. That's been the real advances have all been in machine learning. But the people who are doing that work, I think, are starting to realize they're really bumping up against the limits of the kinds of learning that machines have done so far. And they're realizing that every 3- and 4-year-old can solve problems, can learn things that you can't get a standard, even, a wonderful deep learning algorithm with enormous amounts of data. They can't do things that every 3- and 4-year-old can do. So they're getting to be very excited about talking to cognitive development people and learning about cognitive development. I'm teaching a course this year at Berkeley called Cognitive Development for Computer Scientists. So the students, and indeed a lot of the faculty, are computer scientists who want to know, how is it that, babies and young children are the best learners that we know of in the world. If learning is going to turn out to be the key thing in AI, we should really be looking at these kids. So there's this kind of nice thing about having all these nerdy eats guys suddenly saying, gee, babies and children, they're really cool and really interesting.
You hinted about it earlier, talking about the playground and observing babies. But let's talk about play for a moment. If you were to open up with that room and start talking about play, a lot of the suits might say, oh my gosh, I have to leave. But on the flip side, if people pay attention and start to say, hold on, let's really think about play. Let's try and put ourselves back at that point in time. One great thing about play is, Mike, you feel good. Why don't you talk about some of the bigger picture benefits there that we can learn from childhood play?
Well, play is another one of those sort of evolutionarily paradoxical phenomena, because not just humans, but all young animals play. And it's characteristic of young animals rather than older animals. And of course, the very definition of play is that play is doing a bunch of things that aren't actually going to have immediate benefits. So it seems like a kind of paradox. Why is it that for so many species, we spend so much time doing things just for fun? And the thought is that the sort of for fun is a way of getting a reward for this kind of wide-ranging exploration. The kind of paradox, which I think people are familiar with, is, sometimes if you're trying too hard to do something, that actually keeps you from doing it. And pulling back and just exploring and having fun actually makes you more effective in the long run. So it's this kind of paradox, which is to actually get things done in the long run. Often in the short run, you have to release yourself from the pressure of trying to get things done. And play seems to serve that function in the animal kingdom, and what the kinds of play that we do reflect the kinds of things that we need to do as adults. So, for example, baby rats wrestle and fight, so they do all sorts of play fighting. And the interesting thing is, if you look at, with rats, unlike children, you can actually do the experiment where you see what's the difference between the ones who get to play when they're young and the ones who don't. It isn't any one specific thing that they do, but it's how flexible and resilient they are, how good they are at changing, doing something different quickly in a new context. And that seems to be the general story. So if you just want to do one specific thing and do it well, then the best thing to do is just train a system to do that one specific thing well. But if you want to be resilient, if you want to be able to face a new problem that you've never seen before and be able to do something intelligent about it, then it turns out that playing around actually helps. There's some wonderful work by a roboticist called Hod Lipson, and he was designing a robot that had a period to begin with where it just kind of messed around. It just kind of did silly dances, basically. It played with its own body. And it turned out that the advantage of that period of play was that then if you cut off the robot's leg, it could figure out how to walk even without the leg. So a robot that was just trained to walk could be really good at walking, but if you change the situation, if you cut off a leg or you put it in a new room, it would fall apart. Whereas this robot who'd gotten the chance to play could adjust to a new circumstance, a new situation. And of course, that's what we human beings are better at doing than anything else. That's our great evolutionary niche. We're the ones who are really adapted. The way I put it sometimes is we're adapted to the unknown unknowns. The unknown unknowns, that's where we live. That's our environment. That's the environment that we do best in. And of course, there's more and more unknown unknowns as we've gone on in history.
But what's amazing is the way your work maps this out. And I get back to the Bayesian babies comment and what you're talking about, test, adjust, test, adjust. The younger we are generally, and bell curve wise, that's easier. It happens more. And then we get older and we don't test, adjust anymore. We come up with an idea and we stick with it. And if new things come into our field of vision that invalidate that direction or that idea or that hypothesis, we just keep going. We don't adjust to the new information. I don't know that I'm special in any way, but I feel like I adjust very well. And I'm constantly observing other adults that don't seem to have the ability to adjust anymore. And it always strikes me every time I see it.
Well, again, I think it's important to say, as you can probably tell from listening to me, I'm very pro 4-year-old, and I love 4-year-olds, and I love being in that wild, explore, creative side. But the truth is that there's a genuine trade-off between that and then the ability to actually get things done, to actually execute things, to actually make things happen. And to some extent, if you want to make things happen, you have to ignore a lot of distractions. You can't readjust your strategy every time there's something new. And the great challenge is, how do you go back and forth between exploring, between finding out things that are new, taking new information into account, and actually being focused enough to be able to do the thing that you want to do. One way that you could think of it is, even if you think about it from the perspective of neuroscience, it's as if there are some parts of your brain, sort of roughly speaking, the back of your brain, that is really designed to hold lots of different possibilities, lots of different possible ways of thinking about how the world is. But the trouble is, when you act, you don't get to, sort of do 30% of one policy and 70% of another policy. You just have to choose one policy and follow through. I think the way that people solve this sometimes in computer science, the way neuroscience seems to have solved it, the way evolutionary biology seems to have solved it, is by having these kind of alternating periods, a period of play, exploration, being protected from the immediate environment, and then a period of taking the things that you've learned in that play and exploration and putting them to use. Or sometimes a division of labor of different people with different personalities and different strengths and weaknesses. So people who are really good at general exploration and people who are really good at actually implementing things and making things happen. If you are like me, if you're a scientist, for example, I think there's this constant, probably the hardest thing about being a scientist is this constant tension between, let's think of a really crazy high-risk idea, but wait a minute, there's 50 crazy high-risk ideas. How can I decide which is the one that I should actually turn into an experiment? And how can I decide how to balance the crazy high-risk ideas and the ones that are maybe not quite such high risk, but are more likely to succeed? That's a very hard, challenging thing to do, but I think it's the secret of being a successful scientist, being a successful innovator.
You keep bringing up 4-year-olds. And so you're forcing me as we have this conversation to think the last time that I was around a 4-year-old a lot. And it was my nephew. And so, okay, in my family, there's an assortment of nephews and nieces, all teens now. So I'm having to go back a decade in time. But now, as they're all in their teens, one of them is perhaps the best athlete in the community. And he's just exceptional. And I always hear these generalizations from adults. They're like, well, he just happens to be better, this or that. But I have a very distinct memory of when this boy was 4 years old. We would go to his brother's t-ball games or whatever. His brother's a little bit older. This one little boy who's the exceptional athlete now, at 4 years of age, I would say to him, hey, I'll give you $1 if you run around the field. It was approximately maybe 3/4 of a mile. This 4-year-old boy would run around the field perhaps 8 to 10 times during the game just to collect $1 from me. Now, what we as adults, we look back now as he's a teen and he's an exceptional athlete, and we say, oh, wow, he's just, perhaps some adults just say, well, it's just natural, whatever. And I look back to the 4-year-old time and I say, you know what? That kid had a plan. He knew what he was doing at 4 and he had a plan. Maybe he couldn't describe it. Maybe he didn't know exactly what it was, but that kid had a plan.
Well, I think there's one of the things that's interesting is you can see all of these individual differences in what kinds of things different children think are fascinating and interesting and worth exploring. And I think the secret is when you see children, the things that children get most excited about, the things that are the things that they really feel that they're exploring and that they can master. And that can be really different for different children. One of the things that's interesting, you mentioning your nephew being a teenager, one of the things that we've just started working on now is the idea that adolescence may be a kind of revived period of plasticity. So adolescence may be another time when this kind of possibility and exploration happens. And the traditional picture of adolescence has always been this very negative one. How can we keep them from getting into terrible trouble all the time? And that's a real problem. But increasingly, there's more and more evidence that adolescents are actually exploring more. And in the studies, I mentioned that we did these studies that showed that the preschoolers were actually more exploratory than the adults. Now, that was about a physical problem. That was a problem about a machine and how you put blocks on a machine to make it go. But we also did that with a social problem. Why is this person acting the way that they are? And what we discovered there was that the adolescents were actually the most flexible. So the preschoolers were very flexible. They got less flexible in school age. The adults weren't very flexible in the way they thought about why someone could do what they did. But the adolescents were. The adolescents were paying an awful lot of attention to the data rather than the priors, to put it in a Bayesian way, when the problem was about human action and social relationships. So it seems as if that might be a kind of extra burst of exploration that happens with teenagers.
I would be amiss in the limited time that I have with you still if I did not get your perspective, some greatest hits of perspectives that you might have on some issues of the day that people can perhaps relate to. Not too long ago, James Damore at Google was let go, and he had a certain perspective that he wrote down. He was let go. Could you, in a nutshell, explain his perspective and then perhaps your perspective of that perspective and how maybe we all kind of missed the real important issue in that debate?
One of the general things that happen that you come up against as a developmental psychology, one of the questions that's always seemed to be a really fundamental question is how much of anything that we do is the result of nature or nurture, or how much is it the result of genes and how much is it the result of environment. It's a very natural way of thinking about it, is to act as if, okay, there's one set of forces, nature, genes, biology, and then there's this other set of forces, nurture, parents, environment, teaching, culture. And you could kind of just treat them as if they're a vector, and you just figure out how much of one force is coming in and how much of another force is coming to shape the way that people turn out. And then you could say, okay, well, 35% of this is nature and 65 is nurture, or however the numbers would work out. That's such a natural way of thinking about it. It's very seductive, and there are even, smart popular psychologists who talk that way. But it's totally wrong from a scientific perspective. It's one of those cases where, sort of like our everyday physics turns out to be totally wrong from the perspective of scientific physics. It isn't even It's all, people sometimes say it's not even wrong. It's just the whole wrong way of asking the question. And that's certainly true for nature and nurture, and especially for things like the sex differences that Damar was focusing on. So even the idea that there's a male brain and a female brain, or that there's a male piece that comes from nature versus nurture, just doesn't, it's the wrong categories. It's the kind of category mistake. And there are lots of examples of this. If you look at actual development, what you see is that, from the moment that there's a fertilized egg, the nature and nurture are interacting. And not only are they interacting, but they're interacting in all of these complex, nonlinear, feedback-driven kinds of ways. So it's just not a good question to ask, are women naturally more suited to tech than, naturally less suited to tech than men? That naturally just doesn't mean anything from a developmental perspective. The way I put it, Larry Summers famously got into trouble for making these kinds of arguments as an economist, and I always feel as if, my reaction to Larry Summers doing that is it's as if I went to Larry Summers and said, Larry, look, here's my idea about economics. We just need to find the right price for things. And if we just find the right price and we make sure that everyone is selling everything at the price that's the natural price for that particular commodity, then the economy will work well. Now, that's kind of not even wrong. That's just not getting the most basic things about how economics works, even though for many thousands of years, that was the natural way that people thought about economics and money. And it's kind of like that with the nature, nurture, gender, nature, or nurture kinds of disputes. It's not even the right category for thinking about the problem.
Damar put that out there, and then you hear all the reactions on assorted sides. You're saying we need to take a step back and let's think about this as a scientist, and then you're not left with such black and white answers.
I mean, it's not even just not black and white. It's that let me give you an example of one of the studies that I talked about in my column in the journal after the Damar thing came out. This is a neuroscience study. So one of the things that people talk about is, well, male brains and female brains are different. And it turns out that, in fact, there are various kinds of brain measures. And on average, you'll see a difference between men and women on these particular kinds of brain measures. And that led people to think, okay, there's a kind of naturally male brain and a naturally female brain. But it turns out that if you actually look at the correlation among those features, there isn't any correlation. So most people will score really high in the male direction on some brain parts and really high in the female direction on other brain parts. The term that neuroscientists use is that it's a kind of mosaic. There are different kinds of features, and even though when you average together large numbers of people, it might look as if there's a difference, any individual person is going to be this really complicated mosaic of different kinds of features in different brain areas. And the same thing's true about people's psychological capacities. The other thing is that there's, as we say in psychology, much more within group variance than between group variance. So there's much more difference, even if there's a little bit of difference in the overlaps. There's much more difference among different women and different men than there is between men as a group and women as a group. And again, even if you just look at the very physical fact of being biologically male or biologically female, it turns out that, you might say, well, of course, that's just determined by your genes. But it turns out, actually, there's a very long, complicated, bidirectional set of things that happen from the moment that you have a particular set of chromosomes to the moment that you end up with, female or male genitalia, let alone a brain that has particular characteristics. So it's taking something that's really complicated and making it simple in a way that speaks to, social categories rather than really speaks to the biology, in particular speaks to development. Another point that I think is important to make is very often people act as if something's in your brain, it must be there innately and it must be genetic. And of course, that's not true either. So even if I took a whole bunch of adult men and women and discovered that their brains were different, that's what I'd expect, given that their behaviors are different, given that their social status is different. Of course, their brains are going to be different. The question is, what happened from the time that they were a zygote that led to those differences later on?
See, what's so fun about hearing you explain that, I don't know your politics. It's not relevant to this conversation, but you are diving deep with your training, your skills, your experience, and you're laying it out there in such a way that everyone has to pay attention and say, okay, I have to consider what Allison is saying there because, perhaps I didn't know that. I have to go down that path too. And it's such a contrast to modern life where we do take things and put them into partisan silos immediately when it's just all damn complicated, isn't it?
Well, I mean, this is part of the reason why I and, other people who've been on your podcast, I mean, I think there's a real tension for scientists about when we go out into the world at large, we can't tell the whole story in all its detail and complexity in, 700 words in the Wall Street Journal or even an hour-long podcast. And I think there's a lot of back and forth about, are we oversimplifying? Can we represent the science in a really good way? But I think we're kind of, we don't have a choice. People are going to be having beliefs and making decisions based on what they think the science is, whether the scientists are conveying it properly or not. So we really have, it's not as if we don't do it, somebody else isn't going to be doing it. I think in my field of developmental psychology, that's really vivid. There's no FDA on parenting books. Anybody who wants to can go out and write a book and say, look, if you do this to your children, then they're going to come out great and go to Harvard. There's nobody to stop that except real developmental psychologists trying to say something about what the science really says.
Let's keep it at the developmental level for a moment on something relatively new, because I still recall in the summer of 1995, Netscape went public. That was kind of like the ignition switch. And now roll forward to 2018. And if I give an iPhone to a 3-year-old, their fingers start moving like freaking Mozart. Have you done work, I'm assuming you have started to investigate, what are we starting to see with the early tech in the hands of children? What are some of the big picture lessons and insights that we are learning for good and bad?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. And it's funny because this is one of the examples where everybody thinks they know what the answer to that question is. Apparently, including some of the big funders for Apple. Everyone is convinced that this is terrible and that screens are going to destroy children's minds and that we need to keep them away from children and so on and so forth. It's amazing how deep the conviction is given how completely missing the data is. So, and of course, if you think about it, you said yourself, right? 1995 was Netscape. The first iPhone is now 10, 11 years ago. We're scientists. It takes us 15 years to do any kind of study, let alone try to figure out what the long-term consequences of something are going to be that only happened 10 years ago. But scientists are starting to do that. And my take is, if you look at the big picture, part of what adolescents and children have always been about is about they're the ones who do the technological innovation, whether that technological innovation is putting a new design on a pot or figuring out a new way of throwing a spear or figuring out a new way of organizing your life or having a train or having a telegraph. They're the ones who are always sort of on the cutting edge of that kind of technological change. And in some sense, the function of those children is to be on the cutting edge of technological change. Now, this time may be different from all the other times, but it seems like every time that happens, the previous generation is convinced that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and whatever this thing is. For Socrates, for example, it was actually reading. He thought that reading was a really terrible idea. It was going to mean that nobody remembered anything anymore. And it was also going to mean that people would think anything written in a book, it was true. And of course, he was right. People don't remember all of Homer anymore. People do tend to think that things that are written down are true. But on balance, we feel like the advantages of having writing and reading outweigh the disadvantages. And my guess is that's what's going to happen with the new technologies as well. We'll figure out how to both deal with the positive and the negative sides of them. And the experience for the next generation of children is going to be, the children who have been doing this from the time they were 2 is going to be really different from the kind of disruptive, distracting experience that it is for us as adults. Now, I don't know that that's true. It might be that 20 years from now, we're going to discover that this is finally the technology that's destroyed us all. But one way I put it is, if you're interested in technologies that will just destroy us all, worry about climate change. There's only so many things you can worry about. Climate change, yeah, really worry about that. Don't worry about your kid and his iPhone.
But it's like I think about you think about the tech. We can say, okay, what are all the disadvantages? I could just like sum them up in my mind. I can say, okay, maybe my eyes have gotten a little worse than they would have at this age by using the screens too much. And I see some adults where they've got literally a hunchback from looking at the phones. Maybe people are taking too many selfies and there's too much of that going on. But I think about from the research standpoint and the ability to connect with people, the puzzle-like thrust of all this technology, finding any piece of information, especially for those people that have the curiosity in them and they want to go check out Allison and find your site and start digging through your papers and look at all this work that this lady has done for decades before we got there, and it gives you a head start. That kind of thing. I don't know how any of us can say that's bad.
It's kind of interesting if you look at when printing first started, reading or printing or just about any kind of technological innovation. Printing is a really interesting one. There's a wonderful book about the French Revolution and the Ancien Regime. And it points out that when printing first became really widespread and you could have a lot of cheap printing, the first thing that happened was that the world was full of terrible scandal and libel and polemics and pornography and all the kind of rubbish that you see on the net now. That was what a lot of the first printed pamphlets were like. And it took a while for things to sort of sort themselves out and figure out a way for people to sort through this amazing new source of information. But again, I don't think anyone would look back and say, oh, printing, that was a really terrible idea. Being able to actually have books that were easy and cheap to produce, that was really awful and led to the end of civilization as we know it. And in fact, if you think about it, my own personal example is if you think about the 19th century, think about the telegraph and the train. The truth is nothing technological that we've done in the last 100 years has had the same kind of impact that the telegraph and the train did. So for thousands of years, the fastest you could go was the speed of a fast horse. And then suddenly, literally, information could travel at the speed of light. That was a gigantic transformation, and it had good effects and it had bad effects. Now we look back and we think, oh, isn't that quaint and sweet and how lovely to be riding on a train? People at the time were convinced that trains were going to completely destroy the world. In a way they did. They destroyed the world of the 18th century. And I think the new tech in some ways is going to destroy the world of the 20th century, and it's going to be up to the next generation of children to build the world of the 21st century. One way I put it is it seems to be universally true that the day before you were born is always Eden, and the day after your children are born is Mad Max. That seems to have been true for all of history.
As we go out, let me leave with something, a great line of yours that you've used many times, which I love. And you talk about what's it like to be a baby, being in love in Paris for the first time after you've had 3 double espressos. Why don't you let the audience know how that one came to be and what you really mean when you say that?
One of the big philosophical questions that we can ask about babies, and I talk about this a lot in my second book, The Philosophical Baby, is what's it like to be a baby? What's consciousness like in babies? And again, those philosophers who didn't think very much of babies for all those years often said, well, babies don't have very much consciousness. In fact, they did operations on babies, very young babies, without anesthesia for a while because they thought that they didn't have feeling, didn't have consciousness. Now, it's a really hard question to answer. How do you know that anybody has consciousness, let alone how a baby does? But I think when you actually look at the science, the neuroscience and the cognitive science, it suggests that we may have a really different kind of consciousness when we're babies. The way I like to put this is it's the difference between the kind of spotlight of consciousness we have as adults, where we pay attention to one thing and it's very vivid and everything else around you kind of goes dark, and thinking about the child's consciousness as being more like a lantern. It's more like something that's illuminating the whole world. We know that some of the chemicals in things like nicotine and caffeine seem to have the effect of leading to this broader plasticity, leading to a brain that changes more easily. And we know that putting yourself in the position of a baby, like going to a new place, has the same kind of effect. Consciousness gets to be much more vivid and intense, even if your practical ability to get through the world really gets damaged. So you put all that together, and being in a new state, in a new place, like being in Paris for the first time, and having all these changes to your neurotransmitters that are making them more open and plastic, that sounds a lot like being in Paris after you've had a bunch of double espressos. And as I point out, that is kind of a wonderful way to be. But it does mean that you tend to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning crying, which may be the way it feels to be a baby.
I implore the audience to check out, too. You've got a great TED Talk out there, I think 3 million plus views, but you get into this a little bit more where you've got an example and you dig in. I'm not going to ask you here now. People can go check it out. But you get into something with broccoli and crackers and babies. And I highly recommend people to go check that out for one of those aha moments of like, wow, that's a really cool revelation. Hey, listen, where's the best place we can send people to, Allison? I mean, they can quickly check out your Wikipedia link, and there are papers that go back a long time. You've got many, many books. You're easily found. Would you like to direct people to anywhere?
Well, if you go to my website, which is AllisonGopnik.com, that's got links to the books, and it's got links to my research papers and to some of the popular things like the Wall Street Journal columns and my writing in other places as well. That's probably the best kind of Gopnik Central, the best Gopnik Central place to start. And if you look, there's a section in there called Memoirs that has some stories about what my life was like growing up, and if you're interested in that as well. So that AllisonGopnik.com is probably the best place to start, and that will give you an idea. The other good place to start is my first book, The Scientist in the Crib, which was very much designed to be a kind of all-purpose introduction to this new world of developmental psychology. Or the most recent one, The Gardener and the Carpenter, which is really about these questions, these practical questions about how do we take all this new science, what does it tell us about being a parent, and both being individual parents and what we should think of as states and societies trying to make decisions about children. So those are both two good places to start.
So, I asked and you said, the energy, the passion from being around 4-year-olds. I'm going to have to take you at your word on that. But I have to say, you've inspired me because I like to think of myself as a pretty energetic guy. But I say to myself now, my gosh, as I move forward in the next bunch of decades, assuming I've got those decades, why not stay energized and excited, right? All this boring, placid stuff, that's no fun. You want to have the energy every morning. Do you ever wake up in a morning not excited? There is no way the person that I'm talking to right now ever wakes up and is not excited. Is that true?
I can tell you one thing. I have 3 grandchildren who are the complete joy of my life. And my one practical piece of advice to people is skip the children, just go straight to the grandchildren. I take care of them about once a week. In the morning, when those little faces show up, it's the most exciting, wonderful, great thing in the entire world. By about 9 o'clock, when they're ready to go to sleep, I am really worn out. So if you saw me at the end of a full day of engaging with a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old, there are certainly moments when all that thinking and seeing and engaging in the world can wear you out. But it's well worth it for the day of inspiration. And it is actually true that, if I think about that day versus the working faculty meeting going, filling out the forms, answering emails kinds of days, there's no question that feels like a much better day to be human on.
Allison, I appreciate you taking the time today. Great insights. I could probably pick your mind for hours, but I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks. Happy to talk to you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government, and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.